From A&E, this is Biography.
Walk into any diner in America and you're likely to see his name on ketchup bottles, on pickle jars. Henry J. Heinz has been a part of American culture for more than a century. He said, "I will do the common thing uncommonly well," then did it. Heinz sold his products on every continent. He coined one of the most memorable lines in the history of advertising, 57 varieties. He was an obsessive genius. Yet in an era of domineering bosses and robber barons, Heinz motivated his employees with kindness. H.J. Heinz was certainly an uncommon man, devoted to his religion, his family, and his pickles, but not necessarily in that order. The Heinz family built a business empire from pickles and ketchup.
Henry Heinz was obnoxiously determined. He was a man that once he knew what he wanted was going to get it. That's both a huge gift and something that at times must have been hard to live with.
Howard was forgotten and sort of lost between his great father and his more flamboyant son, but it turns out that he really saved the company.
He was the chairman, and he was Mr. Heinz, and you wouldn't think of even calling him Jack. The president of the company called him Mr. Heinz. There were times when people would say, "He is the most wonderful person in the world," and then there were times you'd see secretaries in tears.
They began as immigrants and made their name known round the globe.
We will never save pennies at the expense of our reputation. It was built on my grandfather's name. That's my name too, Henry J. Heinz.
In public, they were master showmen. In private, indifferent family men. Yet they also did well by doing good, and became a living embodiment of the American dream. The Heinz family saga began with the determination of immigrants to make a better life. In 1843, Henry and Anna Heinz, both recent arrivals from Germany, settled outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The next year, the first of their 8 surviving children was born and christened Henry John Heinz. Anna was a disciplined and devout mother, building her children's character through Bible lessons and folk wisdom. She peppered them with old German mottos like, "Do all the good you can," "Do not live for yourself," and "Always place yourself in the other person's shoes." She planned for H.J. to become a Lutheran minister until she saw his love of the family garden.
She made the children work from sunrise to sunset in this garden, and H.J. was the only one who favored it. In fact, he stayed out there long after the hours were over. He just loved working in the garden.
By age 8, H.J. was selling vegetables. When he was 12, his mother gave him 3 acres of land to tend. The young businessman quickly developed and marketed a growing line of produce and homemade condiments.
And is a very successful junior entrepreneur selling cabbage and cucumbers and zucchini and tomatoes off his wagon to neighbors, and has a growing list of customers. And from the very beginning, from his earliest days of peddling horseradish door to door or from a wagon with his own horse, he wanted to make sure his customers got only pure food.
H.J. Heinz was obsessed with purity. Lutherans associated purity with goodness. Fresh food was healthy food, and H.J.'s keen marketing sense appreciated the commercial value of cleanliness. This was an age when many were suspicious of factory-made food, and with good reason. It was often packaged in filthy conditions and contained a stomach-turning array of cheap fillers. While his competitors used golden brown bottles to hide imperfections, H.J. made a point of selling his mother's horseradish in clear glass containers. H.J.'s father gave his teenage son valuable experience, hiring him to work in his bricklaying business. H.J. took bookkeeping courses and became his father's accountant and later partner. The business prospered, allowing the elder Heinz to take a trip back home to Germany.
While his father was away, he collected the so-called uncollectible debts from his father's business. And with that money, he built a big house for his father and surprised him, and outdid his father at the age of 21. And sort of there was this enormous role reversal which continued afterwards.
H.J.'s success inspired him to strike out on his own. In 1869, at age 25, he courted Sarah Young, a daughter of Irish immigrants who would bring to his new household what his mother had to the old: religious devotion and a stable emotional foundation. On a train to New York for their honeymoon, they met another couple planning to marry. H.J., spotting an opportunity to save money, suggested that both couples share a minister and marry the same day. 1869 was also the year when H.J. joined his friend Clarence Noble to form Heinz Noble and Company. The firm, designed to sell processed condiments across the eastern seaboard, kept H.J. constantly on the road. He reveled in the frenetic travel pace. In one 24-hour period, he trekked to Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and back home to Pittsburgh. The company was modestly profitable until 1875, when mistakes by Noble and a financial recession suddenly threatened its existence. H.J. worked frantically to avoid the specter of bankruptcy. His diaries reveal the confusion of a man who had known only success and could not believe that his God could let him fail.
The diaries read like a Dickensian novel. They're heartrending. He has boils. His wife takes to bed. He's too depressed to go to church, which was unthinkable for him. His brother started to take to drink. The whole family was collapsing.
Several creditors accuse him of basically falsifying his records and demand that he be arrested. He is arrested, held in jail for a day, and comes back the next day to face what is an ever-mounting load of debts and unpaid bills. He is absolutely mortified by this. He is shamed, he is anxious, he is so confused.
He was cleared of the charges, but nothing could save him from repeated humiliation. At one point, he borrowed $700 from his wife's personal savings to cover unpaid bills. He believed that his friends were shunning him and wrote mournfully, "I have no money, so I have no friends." His parents mortgaged their house to raise funds, only to see it repossessed. Creditors came to sell off his mother's furniture. Awash in shame, H.J. could only watch helplessly as the crisis consumed his aging father.
Henry J. Heinz's father had raised a family, established a home in America as an immigrant, and he sees so much of his life wiped out before his eyes.
H.J. felt deeply guilty about the pain he caused his father. The elder Heinz would never recover, spending his final years in and out of sanitariums, a broken man. Just 2 months after bankruptcy, H.J. picked himself up and formed a new company. Through this and other dark moments in his life, he was anchored by twin beliefs: devotion to God and an unshakable vision of his destiny.
He was obsessively determined. He had a dream, he had a vision, and he was just absolutely committed to pursuing it. It is making pure food and distributing it. It is forming a company to do that, and that's what gets Henry Heinz up in the morning.
H.J. felt that his partner had let him down and resolved to trust only family members. In 1877, Sarah gave birth to Howard Cavode Heinz. his middle name a tribute to the man who had lent H.J. money during the bankruptcy. H.J. was a cool and distant father, his relationship with Howard marked by Victorian remoteness. By age 8, Howard was putting in 6 hours a day at the factory, the one sure way to please his father. H.J.'s true passion was exploiting the boon spirit of the day. He guided his new food company to immediate success, taking special pleasure in culinary innovations.
He's experimenting like a woman in a kitchen, making it up as he goes along, and his notebooks are chock-a-block full of fascinating recipes. Everything from peanut butter, which he does not pursue, to baked beans, which he does very successfully, to chutneys.
In 1876, he created the condiment that future generations would associate with his name.
When he was in England, he noticed that they had a product called Ketchup, which was made of fish and different ingredients and different spices. It was a very spicy condiment. And he liked it, and he thought, I wonder if we substituted tomatoes for the fish, what that would taste like.
Ketchup quickly became the linchpin of a growing business. By the mid-1880s, the H.J. Heinz Company was selling dozens of products in all corners of the United States. Henry Heinz had conquered America and was ready to test his vision in the international marketplace. By 1886, 40-year-old Henry Heinz had bounced back from bankruptcy to create a major American company. Eager to expand overseas, he journeyed to London and called on Fortnum and Mason, purveyor of fine food to the royal family.
He stroked his whiskers, put on his top hat, and he bursted right into the front door. And he said to the man, I'd like to see the head buyer. And they said, who are you? And he said, I'm Mr. H.J. Heinz, and I'm from Pittsburgh, USA, and I'd like to sell you some of my products.
He was an awesome salesman. He went in and showed his products and talked about them and had him sample the products. They said, I believe we will take them all. Everybody was shocked, including H.J. Heinz.
Henry Heinz was a century ahead of his time in anticipating the global economy. In 1895, Heinz opened its own plant in London, the first of many overseas outposts. Heinz UK became so successful that many British customers believed it was a local company that expanded to America. Back home in Pittsburgh, Heinz joined a vibrant manufacturing community buzzing with the beat of 24-hour steel mills. Between 1890 and 1897, no less than 17 Heinz factory buildings rose on either side of the aptly named Progress Street. H.J. saw the industrial age as a time of great opportunities and high risks.
Henry Heinz looks at the railroad strikes of 1872, when over 1,000 railroad cars were destroyed in a mob rioting, and the National Guard was called in, and 29 people were killed, and decides, this is not going to be my future. This reinforces his determination to create a different kind of organization where his labor is content, where his labor is motivated, where his labor is industrious.
In an age when horses were often treated better than workers, Henry Heinz embraced his employees as family. He built a model factory resplendent with unheard-of worker luxuries, rooftop gardens, a swimming pool, manicures for female food handlers, live music at lunch, free doctors and dentists. There were quarterly dances, picnics, and free carriage rides, an extraordinary array of benefits that bound workers to the man they called the founder. Decades ahead of other business magnates, H.J. realized the importance of keeping employees happy, as he delighted in saying, heart power is stronger than horsepower.
People that came to work and they were down and trodden, he went over to them, put his hand around them and said, well, better days are ahead. This is what we should do. This is how you can cope with your problem. Let me help you out. And he did this with the employees of the company, and they idolized him. He became a father to practically every employee in the company.
H.J.'s progressive policies created a productive workforce and anchored his company's unique public image.
He was really one of the founders of what today we call public relations, through his use of branding and a clear identity for his company, corporate giveaways, and keeping his company in the public eye in so many different ways.
He initiated the factory tour, inviting the general public to view the immaculate conditions under which Heinz products were packaged. Soon, 20,000 guests a year passed through his factory gates. He mounted a Heinz exhibit at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. At first, hot weather and a poor location kept visitors away. His solution? Hire a half-dozen boys to scatter thousands of specially printed tags across the fairgrounds.
People would stoop over, pick up this tag, and it said, come to the second floor of the agricultural building and you will get a free prize. Well, anything free was really astounding in those days, so people started flocking to the agricultural building. They ran up to the second floor to get this free prize. And what the prize was the little pickle pen. And that started the birth of the famous Heinz pickle pen.
They were so successful and so many people came that they were concerned that the building wouldn't support the weight of all the people coming to visit. And the second floor of the building actually had to be shored up to support the weight of all the people coming.
1 million pickle pins were given away at the fair. Within a year, 50 million pins had been distributed. H.J. discovered ideas in unlikely places, and a chance encounter in 1886 inspired a world-famous advertising slogan.
The 57 Varieties slogan is really one of the great American advertising icons. The funny thing is, it started out when Henry Heinz actually stole an advertising idea from another company. He was riding in an elevated train and saw an advertising card advertising 21 styles of shoes. And he thought, gee, I don't have styles of anything, I have varieties. What can I do to use that slogan?
Heinz ran various numbers through his head, searching for one with a magic, memorable ring to it.
And he wired back to Pittsburgh saying, from now on, I want Heinz 57 Varieties to be on all of our advertising. And the advertising manager said, but Mr. Heinz, we have over 60 varieties already. And he said, I don't care, lump them together. I want it to come out 57 varieties.
Heinz sent his promotional machine into overdrive. Heinz 57 was plastered on streetcars and billboards from coast to coast. He built one of the world's first large electric signs at 23rd Street and 5th Avenue in New York. The sign advertised Heinz Pier at Atlantic City, a clever publicity outlet that flooded New York with pickle pins. Many people traveled by train, and they soon grew accustomed to seeing giant Heinz 57 cement blocks embedded in the hillsides.
These are prominent by the late 1890s. In San Francisco, a foreign visitor comes to the city, stares at one of the hills surrounding San Francisco, and says, my God, they even number the hills in America, when he sees the words Heinz 57.
After 20 years in business, Henry Heinz took his place on the top rung of American tycoons. His mansion occupied one corner of a grand street in the east end of Pittsburgh. His immediate neighbors were named Westinghouse and Carnegie. H.J. had reached the culmination of his dreams, but shortly after moving into his grand estate in 1894, his wife Sarah contracted pneumonia. For 10 torturous days, H.J. and his 3 children maintained a bedside vigil.
And we see in his diaries him vacillating between significant hope and the idea that perhaps she's going to recover, and the increasing sense that she's actually getting much worse, and his growing almost panic that she's going to die.
Sarah died on Thanksgiving Day, leaving H.J. overcome by grief and confusion. His mate was gone, and with her, his fleeting connection to his children. Howard, 18 when his mother died, yearned for closeness with his father, but H.J. was a creature of his time and remained aloof from his son.
One thing that is true of all the Heinz men, and maybe slightly the dark side of the family, is that they were more alive and warmer in public than they were in private with their wives and their children.
H.J. eventually responded to Sarah's death in the only way he knew: public action. He memorialized her by building Sarah Heinz House, an after-school community center that provided safe haven for Pittsburgh youth. Even as he kept distant from his children, H.J. used his modest origins and the image of his first home to promote the company.
In American culture, there's this wonderful mythology of great people who come from humble beginnings, Abraham Lincoln and the log cabin. And in 1904, H.J. Heinz decided to move his house, which had been his childhood home, where he first actually began bottling horseradish, and he shipped it up the river, and he put it in the center of his factory in Pittsburgh. And he called it the little house where we began.
He arranged for hundreds of employees to witness the house's journey downriver. The little home became prominently featured in company advertising, at times depicted with a golden halo. Meanwhile, Howard was learning the company from the ground up, toiling in the factories and working as a salesman. He complemented his father's promotional wizardry with an understanding of the changing times.
It was Howard who persuaded his father to start advertising in magazines to reach a national audience. And at first, H.J. was very resistant to this idea. When Howard asked for $25,000, his father gave him $10,000 and said if it was successful, then he would contribute more money.
The new advertising campaign helped cement Heinz's global empire. By 1904, H.J. was selling his wares on all 6 inhabited continents. Decades before Coca-Cola or McDonald's became symbols of the international economy, Heinz products were found in all corners of the world. H.J.'s personal fame extended beyond the business world. He loved to travel and was constantly exploring faraway lands and potential new markets. At each stop, the local press invariably turned out to welcome the Pickle King.
Whenever he would show up in town, it was highly identifiable. He had this great visage. In his later years, he had this white hair, these mutton chop whiskers. He always dressed extremely well, and people knew him wherever he went. And newspaper reporters would seek him out. I mean, they loved him. I mean, they were able to put a tag on him that he made for good copy.
The son of immigrants had made himself world famous. He had changed eating habits, convincing consumers that food made in an unknown factory thousands of miles distant could be as good, if not better, than homemade. In 1906, he would willingly risk everything he had achieved to defend a point of principle. In 1906, Henry Heinz was 62 years old. Through years of hard work, he had built his company into a global giant. Suddenly, the entire food business came under attack when Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, exposed horrendous conditions in Chicago meatpacking plants. An outraged public demanded federal regulation. Food processors opposed any controls over their highly profitable business. For H.J. Heinz, the bitter debate touched both his company's future and his dearest personal beliefs.
He was an obsessed man, a determined man when it came to purity, when it came to quality, when it came to anything pertaining to products that had his name on it.
His zeal for purity extended beyond the content of his food. Heinz employees were forbidden to smoke or drink at work, and he personally saw to it that Heinz products were not associated with alcohol.
If you found that an establishment was selling liquor and they were also having Heinz ketchup on the table, he would go in and ask that all the ketchup bottles be taken out of that establishment. He would pay for them and walk away from the building with the tomato ketchup under his arm.
H.J. was fond of saying quality is to a product what character is to a man. He already made healthy food. If competitors were forced to match his standards, some would go out of business. When he supported the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, he was branded a traitor, treated as an outcast. Competitors boycotted his products and threatened his life.
Henry Heinz used his great courage and personal charisma to back the 1905 Pure Food and Drug Act. In fact, he was the only food processor to do so. That was a great advantage to the Heinz Company in the long run, but it was really something that could have wrecked the company if things hadn't gone right.
H.J. aroused further wrath when he went with his son Howard to personally lobby President Teddy Roosevelt. As legend has it, the Heinzes convinced Roosevelt that even his beloved Scotch might not be pure. With Roosevelt's support, the landmark Pure Food and Drug Act became law. Howard was 30 years old at the time and playing an increasingly important role. While an emotional gap separated father and son, each brought distinctive strengths to the company.
Howard went to Choate and then to Yale, and he majored in chemistry, and he believed in science. His father preferred the old-fashioned way where you sort of stuck your finger in and you said, more salt, which wasn't exactly scientific or technical. So Howard brought a new sophistication to the business.
1906 was also the year when Howard married the beautiful Elizabeth Rust, heiress to a Michigan fortune. 2 years later, their first son was born and promptly named after his grandfather. Henry John Heinz II would be called Jack and eventually be expected to carry on the family legacy. In 1913, Elizabeth gave birth to Rust, a boy destined to live in the shadow of his older brother. H.J. doted on all his grandchildren, and he delighted in spending time with them. He had always possessed a childlike love of learning, and in later life, the world became his university. He was fascinated by art, architecture, and archaeology, journeying to the Egyptian pyramids and jotting facts in his ever-present notebook.
He was a colorful character. On his 71st birthday, somebody said, how do you feel today? And he didn't say anything, he just jumped over a chair. And that was the kind of guy he was.
To the very end of his days, H.J. lived a vigorous life. He loved the outdoors and riding horses around his grand estate. He considered himself a simple working man and never lost his common touch. Even as an elderly man, he would roll up his sleeves and join workers in the fields. In May 1919, Henry John Heinz died peacefully at the age of 75. Tributes poured in from around the world, but perhaps none would have meant more to H.J. than the grief of his extended corporate family.
They all became so close to him. When he passed away, they were in tears. They rang bells in the company, and it was a day of mourning.
Many Heinz employees felt as though they had lost a father, and they pooled their resources to commission a sculpture of their beloved founder. At age 42, Howard Heinz was thrust into power. None of his previous jobs prepared him to run a multinational corporation, and he could not avoid comparisons with his legendary father.
H.J. was a hard man to live up to. He was such a brilliant guy. He was so good in so many areas. He was such a hard worker that I think it was very hard to be his son. Howard, as brilliant as he was, also was extremely tense and was always trying to live up to his father's image.
Howard had grown up with horror stories of the 1875 bankruptcy. Lessons from that desperate time would play a critical role in the years ahead as the company fought for survival against both a depression and a world war. In 1919, at age 42, Howard Heinz had taken over as head of the H.J. Heinz Company. In private, Howard was stiff and shy, but put a speech in his hands and he became a fiery orator, inspiring devotion from his employees.
And he really loved the people he worked with and his colleagues and friends in business. And this feeling was reciprocated and created a culture of such loyalty and such ambition, I think, for the company that it accounts very much for its success.
Howard united a sprawling empire by imbuing workers with a sense of shared pride. He initiated annual Founders' Day celebrations that paid tribute to his father and built company morale. All 10,000 employees attending 62 different banquets in the United States, Canada, and Britain were linked by the new technology of radio. The 1924 company meeting was addressed by Howard and by President Calvin Coolidge. Howard had inherited his father's sense of public relations and his ever-present optimism. After the 1929 stock market crash, he insisted the economy was sound. Even when the depth of the crisis became clear, Howard maintained a positive outlook. He refused to cut wages and proceeded with plans to build an expensive new employee recreation center.
Companies are closing the doors, people are withdrawing their savings, some people lose their entire savings. But Howard builds a building that, at face value, might not seem to be essential to the operation of the company. A building, the house is an auditorium, this wonderful, huge brick building to rise on the banks of the Allegheny River that still stands today. And it was a testimony to his faith and optimism that, yes, we can get through this. Just that same sort of spirit his father had.
He decided not to lay off any employee. He didn't want to ruin what he called the spirit of the house, which was very important. If his father was the prince of paternalism, Howard was the king of paternalism.
In the Roaring '20s, businesses had borrowed heavily, confident in a boom economy. Howard, remembering his father's harrowing bankruptcy, had avoided debt. Howard was an aggressive capitalist who delighted in competition, playing the financial crisis like a true sportsman. He hired more salesmen. He made more food. On Christmas 1933, he could proudly announce that the company had 60% more employees than a year before. The 1930s saw great clashes between big business and labor. Across America, workers fought for the right to join unions. Mass protests were crushed by police on horseback and hired thugs. In 1936, Heinz employees decided to unionize. Howard battled the change at every turn, angry and bewildered that his people would rebel against his benevolent authority. The struggle was bitter but peaceful. After 5 years of legal wrangling, the Supreme Court ordered Howard to accept unions in his plants.
Howard just took it as a personal affront. It's something that he never quite recovered from. It's just a personal blow to him that his employees wouldn't have faith in his guidance of the company.
Howard had invested most of his emotional capital in the company and found little solace in family life. His father had been remote, and Howard was in turn a distant figure to his sons, Jack and Rust. Rust was unusually artistic and sensitive and never able to fit into the Heinz corporate mold.
There were two kinds of Heinzes, those who were very successful and those who were not. And those who were not, I think he had less patience with, and they all seemed to leave town.
Rust moved to Los Angeles to design cars. In 1939, he was tragically killed in a car accident at age 25. Jack was Howard's heir apparent, and during the 1930s, apprenticed in various low-level positions. He was a young man learning the family business. He was also heir to a name that promised entree to exclusive circles.
The day Jack Heinz met Winston Churchill was certainly a momentous occasion. Churchill looked at him and said, "Young man, your father may want you to start at the bottom of the business, but in my book, it's always better to start at the top."
The Heinz-Churchill friendship was just part of the link between the Ketchup Kings and their favorite foreign country. For 3 generations, the Heinzes had maintained close personal and professional ties to England. When 1939 brought war and threat of Nazi invasion, Howard spent $80,000 out of his own pocket to bolster his overseas friends.
Even before the United States had officially been involved in the war, Howard goes out on a limb and purchases several Spitfires for the British Air Force, a tremendous show of support for the war efforts upon the act of a private citizen.
But Howard would not live to see England's triumph over Hitler. In February 1941, he died suddenly from a stroke at age 64. Estranged from his newly unionized workers and little known by the outside world, his legacy would take years to be properly appreciated.
He was forgotten and sort of lost between his great father and his more flamboyant son. But it turns out that he really saved the company during the Depression. He took a crisis and turned it into this great opportunity.
With his father Howard's untimely death, Jack became head of the company at age 33. He threw himself into the war effort, personally visiting England 5 times. Heinz engineers designed self-heating cans for soldiers in the field. The Pittsburgh plant was converted to produce glider planes, and the company sported a proud new slogan, "From pickles to pursuit planes."
They brought in some folks who were trained in aeronautics. They trained women in the plant to work with plywood and to build the gliders. It was a moment of great pride.
The gliders made in Pittsburgh were used in the D-Day invasion of Normandy. Jack Heinz and his company had risen to the challenge of World War. By 1946, 38-year-old Jack Heinz had already led the H.J.Heinz Company for 5 years. Jack was born to privilege and accustomed to power at an early age. A far cry from his grandfather, he ruled not simply as a CEO, but as Lord and Master.
He was the chairman, and he was Mr. Heinz, and you wouldn't think of even calling him Jack. The president of the company called him Mr. Heinz. Many times he'd ride in the elevator, and you'd go to get in the elevator, and his secretary would hold out his hands, and no one else came in, and Mr. Heinz would turn his back to the door of the elevator, so he didn't have to look at you. It was an interesting aloofness.
In his early years at the helm, Jack maintained tight control over every detail.
He insisted on looking at every single ad before it aired or appeared in print. The problem was he was such a jet setter. He was traveling all over the world, and many times he missed many deadlines because he simply wasn't here to sign off on the ads.
Handsome, rich, and powerful, Jack lived a glamorous life. In 1938, his marriage to Joan Deal produced Henry John Heinz III, later a U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania. Jack and Joan divorced, and in 1953, he married socialite Drew Marr. Jack loved fine food and wine. His refined palate was far removed from the simple taste of his grandfather and from his customers.
He had a great cream of spinach soup in England that he loved. He insisted that one of the Heinz chefs make this soup and sell it. And predictably, the soup did not sell. So he went into a grocery store and he said to somebody, "Why isn't this soup selling?" And the grocer said, "It's called spinach. Nobody likes spinach."
Jack and his wife Drew lived elegantly and were treated as unofficial American royalty. They jetted around the world, visiting friends from Aristotle Onassis to the Queen of England. Often the head of state made a point of greeting the Heinzes.
The expectation was that there would be a meeting with the Prime Minister. The location of the factory in Australia was precipitated by a quick conversation with the Prime Minister, who said, "We need to have a plant in Dandenong, and I think you ought to build one there." And Jack Heinz says, "We will build a plant there," and that's where the plant went.
Like his grandfather and father, Jack exploited new means of publicity, and Heinz ads filled American living rooms from television's earliest days.
Here's another time saver, the quick way to get Heinz ketchup to pour. Watch.
Just tap the neck of the bottle 3 times, and here comes red magic made from Heinz Aristocrat tomatoes.
Our ketchup goes farther than other kinds.
You know it's good because it's Heinz.
Although clearly uncomfortable, Jack agreed to personally pitch his products.
Bacon. We make 24 good, honest soups. Not one of them will stint you. After all, they carry my grandfather's good name. That's my name, too, Henry J. Heinz.
Jack had a soft spot for those in need. In 1947, Heinz donated 3 million packages of baby food to feed the starving children of Europe. Jack became chairman of Community Chest, the forerunner to the United Way, and despite his aloof manner, he continued the long tradition of treating employees as family.
We had an employee who lived here in Pittsburgh who had a son who was terribly crippled. They lived in a house with 10 steps going up the front, nothing that a company would normally get involved in, and nothing that the chairman would ever take notice in most corporations, I think. But within a week, those people were being moved into another house that would accommodate this boy who was traveling in wheelchairs and crutches, just because he was a child of an employee. And no one ever knew about it.
The Heinzes had long been major figures in Pittsburgh philanthropy. In the 1960s, Jack dedicated himself to transforming downtown Pittsburgh into a cultural mecca. When Heinz Hall opened in 1971, the city finally had a home for its world-class symphony. And they had it because of Jack Heinz. Baby food had made much of the Heinz fortune in the post-war years, and Jack was eager to spread its benefits to developing countries and to further profit the Heinz Corporation. In 1986, at age 78, he made an arduous journey to China to open a Heinz plant. The Chinese, who venerate age and lineage, were thrilled that Mr. Heinz himself was present.
If there's a word to describe his energy, even in his declining health, it was the word indefatigable. He had such a driving sense of what he wanted to achieve in life and what he wanted to contribute that it was a passion for him.
Jack would rule over the Heinz empire for 46 years. When he died in 1987, he left behind a mammoth company with millions of worldwide customers. Jack's son had gone into politics, making Jack the last Heinz to run the business. 3 generations labored 112 years to create an enduring family legacy.
Everywhere you go, you can see the word Heinz, you can see Heinz ketchup on the tables, you can see Heinz pickles, you can see the products, and they all go back to Mr. Heinz and his determination that he was going to make his name a worldwide name, which it certainly is today.
I think Heinz's legacy to the world revolved around the industry that he did so very much to create. The world of manufactured food that before Henry Heinz came along simply didn't exist, and that has become a critically important part of the daily rhythms of our homes and our work.
While the Heinzes were better businessmen than fathers or family men, they built a global business and an immense fortune from the seeds planted in an immigrant's garden. John Heinz III broke the family mold by going into politics. The great-grandson of H.J. represented Pennsylvania in the U.S. Senate until he died in a plane crash in 1991. A few years after that, his widow Teresa married another senator, John Kerry of Massachusetts. Teresa Heinz is ranked by Forbes magazine as the 300th richest American with a net worth of nearly $700 million. She's known for giving large chunks of her fortune to various charities. The contributions have even earned her a nickname, Saint Teresa.